Oh, that's a little better. All right, so I am Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook, and we're going to continue Chapter 5, second part of the book. Shall we? We left off. Becca Paulson. No. Becca Paulson. Jesus spoke to her on July 7th. And on July 19th, Ruth McCausland's dolls began to speak to her, is where we left off. So, the townsfolk were surprised, but pleased, when 2 years after Ralph McCausland's death in 1972, his widow ran for the position of Haven Town Constable. A young fellow named Mumphrey ran against her. This fellow was foolish, most people agreed, but they also agreed that he probably couldn't help it. He was new in town and did not know how to behave. Those who discussed the matter at the Haven lunch agreed Mumphrey was more to be pitied than disliked. He ran as a partisan Democrat. The gist of his platform seemed to be that when it came to a position such as constable, the elected official would have to arrest drunks, speeders, and hooligans. He might even be called upon to arrest a dangerous criminal from time to time and run him up to the county jail. Surely the citizens of Haven weren't going to elect a woman to do such a job. Law degree or not, were they? They were, and they did. The vote for McCausland, 407, Murphy, 9. Of his 9 votes, it would be fair to assume he had gotten those of his wife, his brother, his 23-year-old son, and himself. That left 5 uncounted for. No one ever fessed up, but Ruth herself always had an idea that Mr. Moran, out there on the south end of town, had 4 more friends than she would have credited him with. 3 weeks after the election, Mumphrey and his wife left Haven. His son, a nice enough fellow named John, elected to stay. And although he was still, after 14 years, often referred to as the new fella, as in the new fella Mumphrey came by to get his hair cut this morning. Remember when his daddy ran against Ruth and got whipped so bad? And since then, Ruth had never been opposed. The townfolk had rightly seen her candidacy as a public announcement that her period of mourning was over. One amongst many, the unfortunate Murphy had failed to understand was that the lopsided vote had been, in part at least, Haven's way of crying, "Hooray, Ruthie, welcome back." Ralph's death had been sudden and shocking, and it came close, very damn close, to killing the part of her which was outward and giving. That part softened and complemented the dominant side of her personality. Felt. Dominant side was smart, canny, logical, and although she hated to admit it, this last, she knew it was true, sometimes uncharitable. She came to feel that if that outward and giving side of her nature were to lapse, it would be something like killing Ralph a second time. So she came back to Haven, came back to service. In a small town, even one such person can make a crucial difference in how things are, in what jargon meisters are pleased to call the quality of life. That person can become, in fact, something very like the heart of the town. Ruth had been well on her way to becoming such a valuable person when her husband died. 2 years later, after what seemed, in retrospect, to be a long, bleak season in hell, she had rediscovered that valuable person, as one might rediscover something moderately wonderful in the dark attic corner. A piece of carnival glass, or a bentwood rocking chair that was still serviceable. She held it up to the light, made sure it was unbroken, dusted it, polished it, and then returned it to her life. Running for the town constable had only been the first step. She could not have said why this seemed so right, but it did. It seemed the perfect way At the same time, perfect way to at the same time remember Ralph and get on with the work of being herself. And forgot to put up our little thing here. So, sometimes I do forget, but not going to be big. Now everybody knows what we're reading. She thought she would probably find a job both boring and unpleasant, but that had also been true of canvassing for the Cancer Society and serving on the textbook selection committee. Boring and unpleasant did not mean a task was unfruitful, a fact a lot of people seemed not to know or to willfully ignore. And she told herself if she really didn't like it, there was no law to make her stand for re-election. She wanted to serve, not to martyr herself. She hated it. She would let Mumphrey or someone like him to have a turn. But Ruth discovered she liked the job. Among other things, it gave her a chance to put a stop to the same nasty goings on that old John Harley had allowed to continue and grow. Del Cullum, for instance. The Cullums had been in Haven since time out of mind, and Delbert, a thick, browed mechanic who worked at Elt Baker's shell, was probably not the first of them to engage in sexual congress with his daughters. Ooh. The Cullum line was incredibly twisted and interbred. There were at least two cataclysmically retarded Cullums in Pineland, and Ruth knew of. According to town gossip, one had been born with webs between its fingers and toes. Incest was one of those time-honored country traditions of which the Romantic poets rarely write. Its traditional aspect might have been the reason John Harley had never seriously tried to put an end to it. But the idea of tradition, which a grotesque matter cut no ice with Ruth. Good Lord. She went out to the Cullum place. There was shouting. Albion Thurlow heard clearly, although Albion lived a quarter of a mile down the road and was deaf in one ear. Following the shouting, there was the sound of a chainsaw cranking up, followed by a gunshot and a scream. Then the chainsaw stopped, and Albion, standing out in the middle of the road now, one hand shading his eyes as he looked toward the Cullum place, heard girls' voices. Delbert had been cursed with girls, 6 of them, and of course, they literally were his curse, and he theirs, raised in cries and distress. Later, in the Haven lunch, recounting his tale to a fascinated audience, old Albion said that he thought about going back into the house and calling the constable. And then he realized the constable had probably been the one fired the shot. Good Lord, had been the one fired the shot. I just can't talk, I guess. Albion only stood at his mailbox instead, awaiting developments. About 5 minutes after the sound of the chainsaw died, Ruth McCausland drove back toward town. 5 minutes after that, Del Cullum drove by in his pickup. Washed-out wife was in the shotgun seat. A mattress and some cardboard boxes filled with clothes and dishes sat in the truck's bed. Delbert and Maggie Cullum were seen no more in Haven. 3 Cullum girls over 18 went to work in Derry and in Bangor. The 3 minors were placed in foster homes. Most of Haven was glad to see the Cullum family broken up. They had festered out there at the end of the Ridge Road like a rash of poison toadstools growing in a dark cellar. Folks speculated about what Ruth had done and how she did it, but Ruth never told. Nor were the Cullums the only people Ruth McCausland, graying trim, 5'5", 125 pounds, either ran out of town or had jailed over the years. There were the dope-smoking hippies that moved in a mile east of old Frank Garrick Farm, for instance. Those worthless, crab-rattled excuses for human beings came in 1 month and went out on the toe of Ruth's dainty size 5 shoe the next. Frank's niece, who wrote those books, probably smoked some rope from time to time, the town thought. The town thought that all writers must smoke dope, drink to excess, or spend their evenings having sex in odd positions. But she didn't sell it, and the hippies half-mile down from her had been doing just that. Then there was the Jorgensens, out on the Miller Bog Road. Benny Jorgensen died of a stroke, and Iva remarried 3 years later, becoming Iva Haney. Not long after, her 7-year-old son and 5-year-old daughter started having household mishaps. The boy fell getting out of the tub. The girl burned her arm on the stove. Then the boy slipped on the wet kitchen floor and broke his arm, and the girl stepped on a rake, half buried in fallen leaves, and the handle spranged her upside the head. Last, but hardly least, the boy stumbled on the basement stairs while going after some kindling and fractured his skull. For a while it looked as if he wasn't going to pull through. It was a real run of bad luck, all right. Ruth decided there had been enough bad luck at the Haney place. She went out, driving her old Dodge Dart, trying to combine those words, and found Elmer Haney sitting on the porch drinking a quart of Miller Lite, picking his nose and reading Soldier of Fortune magazine. Ruth suggested to Elmer Haney that he was bad luck around Iva's place, particularly for Bethy and Richard Jorgensen. She had noticed, she said, that some stepfathers were very bad luck for their stepchildren. She said she thought their luck might improve if Elmer Haney left town very soon, before the end of the week. "You're not scaring me," Elmer Haney said serenely. "This is my place now. You want to get off it before I brain you with a stick of stove wood, you meddling bitch." "Think it over," Ruth said, smiling. "Is that down to 20? Kristen, is that down to 20? Okay." Joe Paulson had been parked out by the mailbox at the time. He heard the whole thing. Elmer Haney's voice had been slightly raised, and there was nothing wrong with Joe's hearing. The way Joe told it down at the Haven lunch later that day, he had been sorting mail while the two of them argued it up and down, and he couldn't seem to get it sorted just right until the conversation was over. "And how'd you know she was smiling?" Elt Baker said. "Heard it in her voice," Joe replied. Later that same day, Ruth had taken a ride up to the Derry Police State Police Barracks and spoke with Butch Monster Dugan. At 6'8" and 280 pounds, Monster was the largest state cop in New England. Monster would have done anything short of murder, maybe that too, for Ralph's widow. 2 days later, they went back to the Haney place. It was Monster's day off, and he was in civvies. Ira Haney was at work. Bethy was in school. Richard was, of course, still in the hospital. Elmer Haney, who was still unemployed, sat on the porch with a quart of Miller Lite in one hand and the latest issue of Hot Talk in the other. Ruth and Monster Dugan visited with him for an hour or so, and during that hour, Elmer Haney had an extraordinary run of bad luck. Those who saw him leaving town that night said he looked like someone ran him through a potato grinder. But the only one with nerve enough to ask just what happened was old John Harley himself. "Well, a swan," Ruth said, smiling. "It was the darndest thing I ever saw. While we were trying to persuade him his stepkids might live luckier if he left, he decided he wanted to take a shower. Right while we were talking to him, and you know, he fell down in the tub. Then he burned his arm on the stove and slipped on the linoleum while he was backing away from it. Then he decided he wanted some fresh air, and he went outside and stepped on the same rake little Bethy Jorgensen stepped on 2 months ago. And that was that was when he decided he ought to just pack up and go. I think he was right to do it, poor man. He lived luckier himself. He'll live luckier himself somewhere else. 5. She really was the person who came closest to being the heart of the town, and that may have been why she was one of the first to feel the change. It began with a headache and bad dreams. The headache came with the month of July. Sometimes it was so faint she barely noticed it. Then, without warning, it would swell to a thick throbbing beat behind her forehead. It was so bad that the night of July 4th, she called Christina McKean, with whom she had planned to go see the fireworks in Bangor, and begged off. She went to bed that night with light still lingering in the sky outside, but it was dark before she was finally able to drift off to sleep. She supposed the heat and humidity were keeping her awake. They would keep people awake all over New England that night, she reckoned, and this wasn't the first night that had been like this. It had been one of the stillest, hottest summers in her memory. She dreamed of fireworks. Only these fireworks were not red and white and coruscating orange. They were all a dull and terrible green. They burst across the sky in starbursts of light. Only instead of going out, the starfish shapes in the sky oozed together and became huge sores. Looking around, she saw people who had lived with who she had lived with all her life. Harleys and Crenshaws and Browns and Duplessis and Andersons and Clarendons, staring up at the sky, their faces rotted swamp fire green. Excuse me. They stood in front of the post office, the drugstore, the Junkatorium, the Haven Lunch, the Northern National Bank. They stood in front of the school and the Shell station, eyes filled with green fire, mouths hanging stupidly agape. Their teeth were falling out. Justin Hurd turned to her and grinned, lips pulling back to show bare pink gums. In the crazy light of her dream, the saliva streak in those gums looked like snot. Feels good, Justin lisped. She thought, get out of here. They all have to get out of here right now. If they don't, they're going to die the same way Ralph died. Now Justin was walking toward her, and she saw with mountain horror that his face was shriveling and changing. It was becoming, the bulging, stitched face of Lumpkin, her scarecrow doll. She looked around wildly and saw that they had all become dolls. Mabel Noyes turned and stared at her, and Mabel's blue eyes were as calculating and avaricious as ever, but her lips were plumped up in the Cupid's bow smile of a china doll. Tommyknockers, Mabel lisped in the chiming, echoing voice, and Ruth woke up with a gasp, wide-eyed in the dark. Her headache was gone, at least for the time being. She came out of the dream directly into wakefulness with the thought, Ruth, you have to leave right now. Don't even take time to pack a bag. Just pull on some clothes, get in the dart, and go. But she couldn't do that. She could not do that. Instead, she lay down again. After a long time, she slept. 6. When the report came in that the Paulsons' house was burning, the Haven Volunteer Fire Department turned out. But they were surprisingly slow about it. Ruth was there 10 minutes before the first pumper showed up. She would have torn Dick Allison's head off when he finally showed up, except she had known both of the Paulsons were dead. And of course, Dick Allison had known too. That was why he hadn't bothered to hurry. But they did not make Ruth feel a bit better. Quite the opposite. That knowing now, what exactly was that? Ruth didn't know what it was. Even grasping the fact of the knowing was almost impossible. On the day the Paulsons' house burned, Ruth realized that she had been knowing things she had no right to know for a week or more. But it seemed so natural. It didn't come with trumpets and bells. The knowing was just as much a part of her, of anyone in Haven now, as the beat of her heart. She no more thought about it than she thought about her heartbeat thudding softly and steadily in her ears. That is loud for 20. Only she had to think about it, didn't she? Because it was changing Haven, and the changes were not good. 7. Some few days before David Brown disappeared, Ruth realized with dull, dawning dismay that she had been ostracized by the town. No one spat at her when she walked down the street in the morning from her house to her office in the town hall. No one threw stones. She sensed much of the old kindness in their thoughts, but she knew people were turning to follow her progress as she walked. She did this with her head up, her face serene, just as if her head wasn't throbbing and pounding like a rotted tooth, just as if she hadn't spent the previous night, and the night before that, and the night before that, and tossing and turning, dozing into horrible, half-remembered dreams, and then clawing her way out again. They were watching her, watching and waiting for what? But she knew. They were waiting for her to become. 8. In the week between the fire at the Paulsons and Hilly's second gala magic show, things began to go wrong for Ruth. The mail now, that was one thing. She kept on getting bills and circulars and catalogs, but there was no letters, no personal mail of any kind. After 3 days of this, she took a stroll down to the post office. Nancy Voss only stood behind the counter like a lump, looking at her expressionlessly. By the time Ruth finished speaking, she thought she could actually feel the weight of the Voss woman's stare. It felt like two small, dusty stones were lying on her face. In the silence, she could hear something in the office humming and making spider-like scritching noises. She had no idea what it, except it sorts the mail for her, might be, but she didn't like the sound of it. And she didn't like being here with this woman because she had been sleeping with Joe Paulson, and she had hated Becca and hot outside, hotter still in here. Ruth felt sweat break out over her body. Have to fill out a mail complaint form, Nancy Voss said in a slow, inflectionless voice. She slid a white card across the counter. Here you go, Ruth. Her lips pulled back in a cheerless grin. Ruth saw half the woman's teeth were gone. From behind them in the silence, scratch, scratch, scritchity, scratch, 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 scritchity, scratch. Ruth began to fill out the form. Sweat darkened big circles around the armpits of her dress. Outside, the sun beat steadily down on the post office parking lot. It was 90 in the shade. Had to be. And not a breath of wind stirring. And Ruth knew the paving in that lot would be so soft that you could tear off a chunk with your fingers if you wanted. Began to chew it. State the nature of your problem, the form read. I'm going crazy, she thought. This is the nature of my problem. Also, I'm having my first menstrual period in 3 years. In a firm hand, she began to write that she had gotten no first-class mail for a week and wished for the matter to be looked into. Scratch, scratch, scritchity, scratch. What's that noise? She asked, without looking up at from the form. She was afraid to look up. Mail sort and gadget, Nancy droned. I thought it up, paused. But you know that, don't you, Ruth? How could I know a thing like that unless you told me? Ruth asked. And with a tremendous effort, she made her voice pleasant. The pen she was using trembled and blotted the form. Not that it mattered. Her mail wasn't coming because Nancy Voss was throwing it out. That was part of the knowing, too. But Ruth was tough. Her face remained clear and firm. She met Nancy's eyes directly, although she was afraid of that dusky, black gaze, afraid of its weight. Go on and speak up, Ruth's gaze said. I'm not afraid of the likes of you. Good Lord. Speak up. If you expect me to scutter away, squeaking like a mouse, get ready for a surprise. Nancy's... Wait, is this on speech? Okay, I don't know why it's so loud, that's all. It just...
To me, it's quiet.
No, to me, it's loud. I'm really hoping it is quiet, though.
It's hard for me to tell what he's saying.
Unfortunately, I can't... nobody can hear me reading if it's too loud. Nancy's gaze wavered and dropped. She turned away. Call me when you get the card filled out, she said. I got too much work to do to just stand around shooting the breeze. Since Joe died, the work's piled up out of all season. That's probably why your mail isn't. Get out of town, you bitch. Get out while she still let you go. We'll still let you go. Coming just on time, Mrs. McCausland. Do you think so? Keeping her voice light and pleasant now required a superhuman effort. Nancy's last thought had slammed into her like an uppercut. It had been so bright and clear as a lightning stroke. She looked down at the complaint form and saw a large black tumor blotch spreading over it. She crumpled it and threw it away. Scritch, scritch, scratch. The door opened behind her. She turned and saw Bobbi Anderson come in. Hello, Bobbi, she said. Hello, Ruth. Go on, she's right. She's right, got out. She's right, get out while you still can, while you're still allowed. Please, Ruth. We, most of us, bear you no ill will. Are you working on a new novel, Bobbi? Ruth could now barely keep the tremor out of her voice. Hearing thoughts was bad. It made you think you were insane and hallucinating it. Hearing such a thing from Bobbi Anderson while you're still allowed. Of all people, Bobbi Anderson, who was just about the kindest. I didn't hear anything like that, he thought, and grasped the idea with a sort of tired eagerness. I was mistaken, that's all. Bobbi opened her post box and took out a bundle of mail. She looked at her and smiled. Ruth saw she had lost a molar at the bottom left and a canine on the top right. I'll better go now, Ruth, she said gently. Just get in your car and go. Don't you think so? Then she felt herself steady, in spite of her fear and her throbbing head, and she steadied. Never, she said. This is my town. And if you know what's going on, tell the others that know what's going on not to push me. I have friends outside of Haven, friends that will listen to me seriously no matter how crazy what I'm saying might sound. They would listen for my last husband's sake, not for my own. As for you, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. This is your town, too. It used to be, anyway. For a moment, she thought Bobbi looked confused and a little ashamed. Then she smiled sunnily, and there was something in that girlish, gape-toothed grin that scared Ruth more than anything else. It was no more human than a trout's grin. She saw Bobbi in this woman's eyes, and had certainly felt her in her thoughts. But there was nothing of Bobbi in that grin. Whatever you want, Ruth, she said. Everyone in Haven loves you, you know. I think in a week or 2, 3 at the outside, you'll stop fighting. I just thought I'd offer you the option. If you decide to stay, though, that's fine. In a little while, you'll be just fine. 9. She stopped at Cooter's for Tampax. There were none. No Tampax, no Modest, no Stay-Free Maxes or Minis, no generic products or pads or tampons. A hand-lettered sign read, New shipment arrives tomorrow. Sorry for any inconvenience. 10. On July 15th, a Friday, she began having problems with her office phone. In the morning, it was just an annoying loud hum, which she and the person she was talking to had to shout over. By noon, the crackling noise had been added. By 2 p.m., it had gotten so bad that the phone was useless. When she got home, she found that the phone there wasn't noisy at all. It was just smoothly and completely dead. She went next door to the Franz to call the phone company's repair number. Farron. Wendy Farron was making bread in her kitchen, kneading one batch of dough while her mixer worked the second batch. Ruth saw with a weary lack of surprise that the mixer wasn't plugged into the wall, but into what looked like an electric game with its cover off. It was generating a strong glow as Wendy mixed her bread. Sure, go ahead, use the phone, Wendy said. You know. Get out, Ruth, get out of Haven. Where it is, don't you? Yes, she said. She started toward the hall, then paused. I stopped at Cooter's Market. I need sanitary napkins, but they're all out. I know, Wendy smiled, showing three gaps in a smile which had been flawless a week before. I got the second to last box. It will be over soon. Will become a little more, and that part will end. Is that so? Ruth said. Oh, yes, Wendy said, and turned back to her bread. The Farron's phone was working just fine. Ruth was not surprised. The office girl in New England Contel said they would send a man right out. Ruth thanked her, and on the way out, she thanked Wendy Farron. Sure, Wendy said, smiling. Whatever you want, Ruth. Everyone in Haven loves you, you know. Ruth shuddered in spite of the heat. The telephone repair crew came and did something to the connection on the side of Ruth's house. Then they ran a test. The phone worked perfectly. They drove away. An hour later, the phone stopped working again. On the street that evening, she felt a rising whisper of voices in her brain. Thoughts as light as leaves kicked into a momentary rustle by the breath of October wind. Our Ruth, we love you all, Haven loves. But go if you go or change. If you stay, no one wants to hurt you, Ruth. So get out or stay. Yes, get out or stay, but leave us. Yes, leave us alone, Ruth. Don't interfere. Let us be. Let us be. Become. Yes. Let us become. Let us alone to become. She walked slowly, head throbbing with voices. She glanced into the Haven lunch. Beach Jernigan, the short order cook, raised a hand to her. Ruth raised one in return. She saw Beach's mouth move, clearly forming the words, "There she goes." Several men at the counter turned around and waved. They smiled. She saw empty gapes where teeth had been not long ago. She passed Cooter's Market. She passed the United Methodist Church. Ahead of her now was the town hall, with a square brick clock tower. The hands of the clock stood at 7:15. 7:15 of a summer night, and all over Haven, men would be opening cold beers and turning radios to the voice of Ned Martin and the sound of Red Sox warm-up. She could see Bobbi Tremaine, and Stephanie Colson walking slowly toward the edge of town along Route 9, hand in hand. They had been going together for 4 years, and it really was a wonder Stephanie wasn't pregnant yet, Ruth thought. Just a July evening with twilight coming on. Everything normal. Nothing was normal. Hilly Brown and Barney Applegate came out of the library, Lily's little brother trailing behind them like a tail of a kite. She asked to see what books the boys had gotten, and they showed her readily enough. Only in little David Brown's eyes had she seen a hesitant acknowledgment of the panic she felt, and felt it in his mind. She had felt his fear and did nothing about it, was the main reason she drove herself so hard when the little boy disappeared 2 days later. Someone else might have justified it, might have said, look, I had enough on my plate without worrying about what was dished on David Brown's. But she wasn't the sort of woman who could find any comfort in such loud defensiveness. She had felt that boy's low terror. Worse, she had felt his resignation. his sureness that nothing could stop events, that he would simply wind along their preordained course from bad to worse. And as if to prove him right, hey, presto, David was gone. And like the boy's grandfather, Ruth shouldered her share of the guilt. At the town hall, she turned and walked back to her house, keeping her face pleasant in spite of her drilling headache, in spite of her dismay. The thoughts swirled and rustled and danced. Love you, Ruth. We can wait, Ruth. Go to sleep. Yes, go to sleep and dream. Dream of things, dream of ways to become, ways to become, ways to. She went into her house and locked the door behind her and went upstairs and pressed her face into her pillow. Dream of ways to become. Oh God, she wished she knew exactly what that meant. If you go, go. If you stay, change. She wished she knew because whatever it meant, whether she wanted it or not, it was happening to her. No matter how much she resisted, she was also becoming. Yes, Ruth, yes. Sleep, dream, think, become. Yes, Ruth, yes. These thoughts, rustling and alien, followed her down into sleep and then funneled away into darkness. She lay crosswise on the big bed, fully dressed and slept deeply. When she woke, her body was stiff and her mind felt clear and refreshed. Her headache had blown away like smoke. Her period, so oddly undignified and shameful after she had thought that was finally over for good, had stopped. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, she felt herself. She would have a long, cool shower and then set about getting to the bottom of this. If what it took was outside help, okay. If she had to spend a few days or a few weeks with people thinking she was off her rocker, so be it. She had spent her life building a reputation of for sanity and trustworthiness. And what good would such a reputation be if it couldn't convince people to take you seriously when you sounded nuts? And as she began to take off her sleep-rumpled dress, her fingers suddenly froze on the buttons. Her tongue had found an empty place in the line of her bottom teeth. There was a dull, distant pain there. Her eyes dropped to the coverlet of the bed. On it, where her head had been, she saw the tooth that had fallen out in the night. Suddenly, nothing seemed simple anymore. Nothing at all. Ruth was aware that her headache had returned. 11. Yeah, we got a few more pages and then we'll go on to 6. There was even hotter weather in store for Haven. In August, there would be a week when temperatures would crack the 100-degree mark every single day. But in the meantime, the July stretch of hot and muggy, which ran from the 12th to the 19th, was more than enough for everyone in town. Thank you very much. The streets shimmered. The leaves on the trees hung limp and dusty. Sounds carried in the still air. Bobbi Anderson's old truck, now rebuilt into a digging machine, could be heard clearly in Haven Village for most of the 8-day hot spell. People knew something important was going on out there at the old Garrick place. Important for the whole town. But no one mentioned it out loud. Any more than they mentioned the fact that it had driven Justin Hurd, Bobbi's nearest neighbor, quite mad. Justin was building things. It was a part of his becoming. But because he had gone crazy, some of the stuff he built was potentially dangerous. One of them was a thing that set up harmonic waves in the Earth's crust. Waves which could possibly trigger an earthquake big enough to tear a state wide open and send the eastern half sliding into the Atlantic. Justin had made this harmonic wave machine to get the goddamn rabbits and woodchucks out of his burrows. They were eating all his fucking lettuces. I'll shake the little bastards out, he thought. Beach Jernigan went out to Justin's place one day while Justin was out harrowing up the crops in his west field. He plowed under 12 acres of corn that day. Sweat profusely, lips pulled back in a constant, maniacal grimace as he worried about saving 3 rows of lettuces, and dismantled the gadget, which consisted of cannibalized stereo components. When Justin returned, he would find his gadget gone, perhaps assume the goddamn chucks and rabbits had stolen it, and maybe set about rebuilding it, in which case Beach or someone else would dismantle it again. Or maybe, if they were lucky, he would feel called upon to build something less dangerous. The sun rose each day in the sky the color of pallid china, and then seemed to hang at the roof of the world. Behind the Haven lunch, a line of dogs lay in the scant shade of the overhanging eave, panting, even too hot to scratch fleas. The streets were mostly deserted. Every now and then, someone would travel through Haven on his way up to or back from Derry and Bangor. Not too many, though, because the turnpike was so much quicker. Those who did pass through noticed an odd and sudden improvement in radio reception. One startled truck driver on Route 9, because he had gotten bored on I-95, turned on a radio station which turned out to be broadcasting from Chicago. 2 old folks bound for Bar Harbor found a classical music station for Florida. That eerie, bell-clear reception faded when they were clear of Haven again. Some through travelers experienced more unpleasant side effects, headaches and nausea, mostly, sometimes even severe nausea. This was most commonly blamed on the road food gone punky in the heat. A little boy from Quebec, headed for Old Orchard Beach with his parents, lost 4 baby teeth in 10 minutes. In the 10 minutes it took the family station wagon to pass from one side of Haven to the other. The little boy's mother swore in French that she had never seen anything like it in her life. That night, in the Old Orchard Beach Hotel, the tooth fairy took them, and only one had been loose, the little boy's mother declared, and replaced them with $1. A mathematician from MIT headed up to UMO for a 2-day conference on semi-logical numbers, suddenly realized that he was on the verge of grasping an entirely new way of looking at mathematics and mathematical philosophy. His face went gray, his perspiring skin suddenly cold as he grasped with perfect clarity how much concept could quickly produce proof that every even number over 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers, how the concept could be used to trisect the angle, how it could. He pulled over, scrambled out of his car, and threw up in the ditch. He stood trembling and weak-kneed over the mess, which contained one of his canines, although he was just then much too excited to realize he'd lost a tooth. His fingers itching to hold a piece of chalk, to cover the blackboard with sins and cosins. Visions of the Nobel Prize jittered in his overheated brain. He threw himself back into the car and began to drive toward Orono again, punching his rusty Subaru up to 80. By the time he got to Hampton, his glorious vision had clouded over. By the time he reached Orono, there was nothing left but a glimmer. He supposed it had been a momentary heat stroke. Only the vomiting had been real, that he could smell on his clothes. During the first day of the conference, he was pale and silent, offering little, mourning his glorious, ephemeral vision. That was also the morning Mabel Noyes became an unperson while puttering in her basement of the Junkatorium. It would not have been correct to say that she killed herself by accident or died by misadventure. Neither of those phrases exactly explained what had happened to her. Mabel didn't put a bullet in her head while cleaning a gun, or stick a finger in an electrical socket. She simply collapsed her own molecules and winked out of existence. It was quick and not a bit messy. There was a flash of blue light, and she was gone. Nothing was left but one smoldering bra strap and a gadget that looked like a silver polisher. That, in fact, was exactly what the gadget was supposed to be. Mabel thought it would make a dirty, tiresome job much easier, and wondered why she had never made such a gadget before. Or why, for goodness sake, there weren't places where you could buy them, since it was a perfectly easy thing to make. And those gooks over there in Korea probably turn them out by the ton. God knew that Korea gooks turned enough other things out by the ton. Although she supposed she ought to just be grateful, since the gooks had apparently gotten too uppity to do the little stuff. She had begun to see all sorts of things that she could make from the used appliances in her shop. Wonderful things. She kept looking in the catalogs and kept being amazed to find they weren't there. My God, she thought, I think I'm going to be rich. Only she had made some sort of cross connection on the silver polisher and corked off into the twilight zone just under 0.0006 of a nanosecond. She was not in truth greatly missed in Haven. The town lay limp at the bottom of the stagnant bowl of air. From the woods behind the Garrick place came the sounds of engines as Bobbi and Gardner went on digging. Otherwise, the whole town seemed to doze. Twelve. Blah, blah, blah. Ruth wasn't dozing that afternoon. She was thinking about those sounds coming from Bobbi Anderson's place. She, at least, no longer thought of it as the old Garrick farm, and about Bobbi Anderson herself. There was a communal well of knowledge in town now, a pool of thought they all shared. A month ago, Ruth would have found such an idea insane. Now, it was undeniable. Like the rising, whispering voices, the knowledge was there. Part of it was knowing that Bobbi had started all this. It had been inadvertent, but she had set it in motion. Now, she and her friend. A friend was a perfect blank to Ruth. She knew about him only because she had seen him out there, sitting on the porch with Bobbi. Evening. You read that? That how long? Anyway, sitting on the porch with Bobbi. Evenings. We're working 12 and 14-hour days, making it worse. She didn't think the friend had any real idea what he was doing. He was somehow outside of the communal net. How were they making it worse? She didn't know. Didn't even know for sure what they were doing. That was also blocked. Not just from Ruth, but from everyone in Haven. They would know in time. They would not come to knowledge, but become to it. As the town wide demonstration of every woman between the ages of about 8 and 60 had stopped at about the same time. It had something to do with digging. That was all Ruth could tell. One afternoon, I missed where I stopped. It had something to do with the digging. That was all Ruth could tell. One afternoon she napped lightly and dreamed Bobbi and her friend from Troy were unearthing a great silver cylinder some 200 feet across. As they uncovered more and more of it, she could see a much smaller cylinder. This one's steel, perhaps 10 feet across and 5 feet high, protruding nipple-like from the center of the thing. Etched on this nipple was a plus sign symbol, and as she woke, Ruth understood. She had dreamed of a gigantic alkaline battery entombed in the earth, and the earth and granite of the land behind Bobbi's house, a battery bigger than Frank Spruce's dairy farm. Ruth knew that, whatever Bobbi and her friend were digging up in the woods, it certainly wasn't a gigantic, ever-ready, long-life D-cell battery, except, in a way, she thought that was exactly what it was. Bobbi had discovered some huge power source and had become its prisoner. That same force simultaneously galvanizing and imprisoning the whole town, and it was growing steadily stronger. Her mind whispered, "You've got to let it go. You've got to stand back and let it run its course. They have loved you, Ruth. That much is true. You hear their voices in your head like a rising wind, lifting October leaves. Now, not just puffing them and letting them drop, but whipping them into a cyclone. You hear their voices, their mind voices, and although they are sometimes garbled and confused, I don't think they can lie. And when these rising voices say they have loved you, still do love you, they are telling the truth. But if you meddle into what's going on here, I think they'll kill you, Ruth. Not Bobbi's friend. He's immune somehow. He doesn't hear voices. He doesn't become, except drunk. That's what Bobbi's voice says. Guard becomes drunk. But as for the rest of them, if you meddle in their business, they will kill you, Ruth. Gently, with love. So just stand back and let it happen." But if she did, her town would be destroyed, not changed, the way its name had been changed again and again, not hurt, as that sweet-talking preacher had hurt it, but destroyed. And she would be destroyed with it, because the force was already nibbling away at the core of her. She felt it. All right, then, what do I do? For the time being, nothing. Things must get better on their own. In the meantime, was there any way she could guard her thoughts? She began to experiment with tongue twisters. She sells seashells down by the seashore. Betty Bitter bought some butter. Peter Piper picked a pick of pickled peppers. With a little practice, she found she could keep one of them playing constantly in the back of her mind. She walked downtown to the market. She got ground meat, 2 ears of fresh corn for her dinner. Spoke pleasantly with Madge Tillotts, the checkout counter, and Dave Rutledge, who was sitting in his accustomed place at the front of the store, caning a chair slowly with his old, bunched and arthritic hands. Except old David wasn't looking as old as he used to these days. Nowhere near. Both of them looked at her, wary, surprised, puzzled. "They hear me, but not very well. I'm jamming them. I really am." She didn't know how successfully, and it wouldn't do to blank on her ability to do it, but it worked. That didn't mean they couldn't hear her if several of them linked up and worked together at picking her brain. She sensed that might be possible, but it was something, at least. One arrow of a previously empty quiver. That night, Saturday night, she decided she would wait till Tuesday noon, roughly 60 hours. If things continued to deteriorate, she would go to the state police barracks in Derry, seek out some of her husband's old friends, Monster Dugan for a start, and tell them what was going on 40 miles or so downstate on Route 9. It was maybe not the best of plans, but it would have to do. Ruth McCausland fell asleep. and dreamed of batteries in the earth. We're going to stop there because I have a few things I need to do. But we are going to have Ruth McCausland included, I do believe is what the next chapter is called. Yes, included. So, and that chapter is quite long as well. So we'll try to get through it the best that we can. And if we can, we will finish chapter 6 tonight. So let's see if we can get through it. But we're learning more about each of the citizens, which is kind of cool. I like that idea. I wonder if we're going to find out what happened at the town hall from the last chapter. So let's cross our fingers. We might be able to figure it out. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys go. I am going to go get me a drink and do what I need to do. And I will be back at 7 tonight. All right? Love y'all. Talk to you soon. Bye.